Good evening all. Happy New Year, if I can still do that this late in January. Welcome to our audience with first one of the year. And I'm really pleased to say that we've got a great speaker tonight. I've had a quick sneak peek at his slides, so I know we're in for a real treat here and quite a canter across the space agenda in the sort of contemporary times. So I'm really looking forward to this. The standard rules apply. It'll be 20 minutes roughly speaking, and then 40 minutes Q&A. You can put your Q&As into the standard Zoom format. I will then pick them out of there and transmit them to Anu. So just keep putting your questions to him through that method as soon as you wish to. Anu is very keen. He's actually, bless him, he is live from Holland today. He's only just travelled over there, so we caught him on his travels, but really appreciate him doing this for us. He is happy to speak on a personal basis, so there are no Chatham House rules on this. He's going to be frank and candid with us, but you know, anybody that advises governments or talks in this space, excuse the pun, always have to be a little bit careful what they say. So please treat it with the respect it deserves, because he's going to give you as candid an opinion as he can from his own personal point of view. So it's really great to be privileged to listen to that. I know you've seen his bio, but just a quick canter. I mean, Anu has been around the space world for quite some time now, which perhaps to these days seems de rigueur, but you know, it is still very much baby steps in the latest movements that we put into space, notwithstanding when we last went to the moon. But Anu has been right in the thick of it, advising governments. He's currently director of the National Space Academy. He's an absolute expert on skills and education, but also on human spaceflight. If he's not a rocket scientist, he's certainly a space scientist. And Anu, we're so pleased to have you here for our first one of 23. So without further ado, over to you. We look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks very much, Greg, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to speak to everyone, not just from the Aerospace Power Association, but also the Freeman Air and Space Institute. Now, I'm gonna try and multitask here. If I get onto my sharing screen and I pick the right one, I share it, and I go here. I'm just going to check with you, Greg. Now, have you got my full screen showing?
Yeah, it's working now. I've got the slowest bandwidth of anybody on the screen, but yeah, all good.
Excellent stuff. So we're in a good place. So what I want to do in the 20 minutes is I want to give. This is not an exhaustive overview of the last 12 months in space activity, but I wanted to pick some key highlights to focus on, and then more importantly, I want to look forwards. In some cases, it'll be over the next 12 months. In other cases, it might be for sort of long-term goals over the next 5 years, looking at opportunities and looking at challenges as well. But I wanted to start, I'm in Holland at ESA's European Space Technical Engineering Centre, which is the technical heart of the European Space Agency, in which the UK has a massive role. But I'm not there at the moment. I'm in a hotel room, so I apologise about the light conditions here, but I wanted to start that, you know, my base is in Leicester at the National Space Centre. So just reminding us, you know, we're going on a journey courtesy of Google Earth from the Space Centre in Leicester up to the internationally accepted boundary of space. And of course, once we get to that 100-kilometre ratified threshold of space, you know, our horizon distance now is approaching 1,000 kilometers. We're looking northwards towards Scotland here. And of course, when we see either simulated or real imagery like this, we need to remember that in order to get into space and stay into space, we're dealing from that engineering, from that thermal, from that pressure point of view in the harshest environment imaginable. And so even though we've been doing space stuff for more than 66 years, this will be the 66th year since the first launch into space, into orbit in 1957, it's still pushing our science and technology to the limits. And, you know, we saw what happened with Virgin Orbit last week. We need to remember, I checked the stats, and for last year, in terms of the 150 or so launches, there was a 6% launch failure. Okay, because this is a challenging environment to get through. It's still pushing our science and engineering capabilities to the limit. And of course, we need to remember, and this was a really good time, I think, to highlight this, that back in the 1950s, you know, the driver for space exploration, for space exploitation, you know, it wasn't idealism, it was geopolitics. Now, back then, it was Soviet Union, United States, communism, capitalism. We know the story, but we're in the most exciting and challenging time in space activities since then. And once again, this is being driven by geopolitical concerns. And I'll come back at the very end to update you on China's astonishing progress, not just in the last 5 years, but in the last 18 months as well. And as a reminder, you know, many of you will have seen this slide from me before, but for those who haven't, you know, this is my attempt to answer that question. What do you mean by space stuff, Anu? And quite simply, it's looking out there, which is astronomy. It's going out there, which is exploration. And it's looking back here, which is the world of satellite applications, space for the benefit of life on Earth. And this, of course, is behind the phenomenal economic impact that space has. Global commercial satellite revenues from the telecom sector and from, you know, other forms of connectivity and data exploitation, it's approaching $450 billion per year. So you can see the economic, you can see the other interests in maintaining all of these areas of space activity. So some highlights from these areas. I'll start with astronomy from the research side. The launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. After many delays, in fact, the animation that you're seeing was a mock-up to try to schematically show the launch, but this was made back in 2008, 2009. Well, we launched on Christmas Day 2021, and we're now at this, what we call the Earth-Sun Lagrange 2 point. So we're 1.4 million kilometers from the Earth, and Webb is so much bigger than Hubble, and already we're getting some absolutely astonishing science revelations. And I just want to share a few of those with you. So first of all, to compare the sorts of images we're getting from Webb and Hubble, it's not a fair comparison directly, because Hubble is a visible and near infrared instrument, whereas Webb is looking mainly in the infrared, both near and far infrared. But you can start to see the increase in resolution when we're looking at images of the same sorts of objects. And just as a nice montage, we're seeing this at the scale of individual stars or of nebulae. And then when we're looking left and right, when we're looking at galaxies, you know, these clusters of hundreds of billions of stars. On the right-hand side, we've got Stephan's quintet. And then the image on the left, I'll come to in my next slide, because I think those of you who've heard me talking before have often, you know, I highlight this astonishing image from Hubble that was taken nearly 20 years ago, the ultra-deep field. So to give you an idea, this is a patch of sky. For the mathematicians, it's got an angular size of 1/20th of a degree. But basically, you know, you put a 1 millimeter square on your thumbnail, you hold it up to the sky, and Hubble looked at this empty patch of sky. Exposure time was 1 million seconds, and what we saw was 10,000 dots of light, each of which is a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of stars. Now, that was pretty mind-blowing. Webb has done a similar calibration image, and we get similar levels of galaxies. But the point I want to make here is that this Webb image of 10,000 galaxies would fit comfortably into the top left corner of the Hubble image. This image that you're seeing from Webb is 1/100th the size in area of the image that I'm showing you with Hubble. So again, we're seeing new breakthroughs in our understanding astronomically. Moving on to exploration, you know, the ISS is now in what we call its golden era. I mean, that's a marketing spin that is sometimes put on it, but the collaboration has had real challenges, of course, with the ongoing deterioration of conditions with Russia. We're in the last 10 years of operation. So the former boss of Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, had made all sorts of noises about deorbiting their segments. Well, he's gone. He's been ousted. We're still in the collaboration, but it is very, very strained. And, you know, we are rightly trying as much as we can within our space partnerships to hold Russia to account. We're still working with Russia, but we're foreseeing now about another 8 years of life on the ISS before we deorbit it in 2031, because some of these modules have been up there for 25 years now. First modules were launched in 1998. Our international collection of science laboratories in low Earth orbit. But of course, after this hiatus of decades, we're returning to the moon, and we've had the Artemis mission. So Artemis 1, the first flight test of the Orion capsule that's going to return astronauts to the moon. And what I wanted to highlight here, we saw the images in November. This is a lovely image of Orion. We need to remember the service module is built by Europe. So I wanted to pick this image because everyone forgets, and I don't think we highlight enough, that this is not just NASA, but as you can see in this one image, this is ESA as well. And so the European Space Agency is absolutely crucial in order to get humans back to the moon and to explore further still. But it's often overlooked and understated. We've had finally the results of our second ESA astronaut selection as an agency in our own right. We had 22,000 applicants, and I've got the data from the first stage where 1,000 were picked out of the 23,000. In terms of astronauts and the para-astronaut program, so astronauts with physical limitations. What's really interesting is that ESA did blind recruiting. So when the assessments were made at the first stage, all reference to gender was removed. And you can see that it was 61%, 39%. But as we went through the process, we found we got much, much more towards that gender equality, not as an externally imposed forcing function, but just through the talent and the selection parameters. And of course, at the ESA Council of Ministers, which is where our member states discuss their funding requirements, we had 17 new ESA astronauts, one para-astronaut, John McFall, who's British, and 5 additions to the core astronaut corps with 11 reserves. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And in terms of satellite application, again, you may have seen in the media earlier this week, we finally had confirmation that after decades of repairing itself, the damage that's been done to the ozone hole that forms every Antarctic summer in June and July over the southern hemisphere, it is repairing itself. So this is a data set from 2018, and we're still seeing that large ozone hole. What we're finding now, even in the last 5 years, it was really minimized. But I wanted to highlight this because remember, we made this discovery through British Antarctic Survey scientists in the 1980s, through ground calibration to try to match the data that was coming from space. We realized pretty quickly who the culprit was. It was the CFC chemicals that we were using in our aerosols and our fridges. But they lurk in the stratosphere for decades. So we stopped through the Montreal protocols that CFC contamination back in 1987, 1988, but it's taken until now to repair itself. And I think we need to remember this, especially if we're going to consider upping some of our space activities in terms of launches by a factor of 10 or even 50. And of course, in terms of what we're also seeing developments on, we've got wonderful satellite data here, but what we're doing is we're combining it with our supercomputing and AI computational capabilities, because what we now can do is use the data from space with modeling to try to use space data to creatively address some of the massive environmental and energy consumption challenges we face. So we've got a data set here from Qatar where using computational fluid dynamics modeling coupled with satellite data and digital terrain modeling from satellites in whole areas of Doha now, there's been a 40% reduction in the use of electricity for air conditioning, because we can start to model that traditional Gulf states technique of natural ventilation, combine it with our satellite data and reduce our energy impacts and try to work towards net zero. And finally, of course, I think last year, the last 2-3 years actually have been the year where the whole world has realized, policymakers to the general public, that for defense capabilities, space is not a nice to have, it's a must have. So I'm highlighting here, Maxar, a commercial company's exposure of what was happening in Xinjiang, what was happening with Iran's program. On the right-hand side, when we had the Russian narrative about what was happening in February in Ukraine, Maxar released the imagery to say, look, this is the truth of what is going on. And of course, looking at Ukraine and the maintenance of communications capabilities, what you're seeing now is I snapshot this earlier today using Leo Labs, which is a software. It's open source. You can look it up. So those are the 3,500 Starlink satellites that are currently in orbit that have enabled the Ukrainian economy and united efforts to keep going. And this leads us very nicely then to the future. So first of all, the UK space sector is continuing to grow. I've got headline figures there, but the key point I want to make is 15% of our country's GDP is critically dependent on services from space. I mean, the economic value of that there, it's in excess of 300 billion. So space is now part of our critical national infrastructure, not just on the civil side, but on the defense side as well. So what can we look forward to in the next 3 to 5 years? Well, I talked about Webb. This is Jupiter, as you've probably never seen it before. It's a stunning image of Jupiter taken by Webb about 2 or 3 months ago. And you can see that really, really faint Jovian ring system that many people overlook. But what we're going to see in terms of getting data much better than this is Europe's JUICE mission, the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, launching in April this year. This is going to launch from French Guiana, and it's going to go on an 8-year mission over more than 1 billion kilometers, as you can see its trajectory here. It's going to do 4 planetary flybys of the Earth, of Venus, of Earth, and of Earth again, and it's going to arrive at Jupiter in 2031. You know, an enormous distance. This is in the outer solar system. And of course, once it gets to Jupiter, it's going to start a 4-year mission with multiple orbits of the planet, as you can see here. You can see the velocities and distances that it's traveling there, and it's finally going to go into orbit around the largest moon in the solar system, Ganymede, for a 4-year mission with final impact on the surface in 2035. And why we're concentrating on these icy moons is we now know that several of them, underneath their icy crusts, they have got extensive salt water oceans, and in some cases, with moons like Enceladus, it's a warm saltwater ocean, and we know we've got organic molecules in there. So potential habitats for life that is still living elsewhere in the solar system. In terms of exploration, the Artemis program, it's all about building the Gateway station, a station in lunar orbit, much smaller than the International Space Station, of course, not going to be permanently occupied. We'll have missions there for 1 year at a time, each year lasting about a month at a time, but critically with surface operations as well. And so we are on track, hopefully, to return humans to the lunar surface by 2025. And when we look at the other major player that's come up, this, what I'm showing you now is not a graphic mock-up. This is an actual image that was released by SpaceX of the Starship launch vehicle. I think this one was taken 2 weeks ago at Boca Chica near the Mexican border. Starship is this technology which people are talking about is going to reduce the cost of access to space by a factor of 10, 20, or even 30. There's still a lot of proving that needs to be done, but we can see the reusability of all of the elements of this is what's going to reduce that cost of access to space. At the moment, SpaceX have brought the cost of getting 1 kilogram of material into low Earth orbit from $20,000 a kilo to about $2,500 a kilo. Starship may bring it down to $500 or even $200 per kilo. There's a great deal of marketing that goes on around this, but there's still a lot of technological and performance demonstration hurdles that Starship has got to do. And in terms of the astronauts who are going to go to the moon, you know, we've got the NASA astronauts, we've got the Canadian Space Agency. The first mission to go back to the moon with humans for more than 50 years is going to be the next Artemis mission in 2024. 3 NASA astronauts, 1 Canadian Space Agency astronaut. And it's the mission after that that's going to land on the surface. The UAE Space Agency is involved. So, you know, they have a 4-strong astronaut corps. Sultan Al Nayadi, their second astronaut, is going to be launching very soon in the next couple of weeks on a 6-month mission to the ISS. Nora Al-Matroshi on the right-hand side, she's finished her training. I fully expect to see her in lunar orbit in the late 2020s. And on the bottom right, we've got our 4 British astronauts. We've got Tim Peake. We've got 2 reserves, so Dr. Megan Christian next to Tim. We've got John McFall, again, a medical doctor on the right-hand side, our Paralympian astronaut as a medical doctor. And third from the right, we've got our full-time astronaut, Dr. Rosemary Coogan. And our goal should be to secure an ESA astronaut slot for a British astronaut in lunar orbit by the end of this decade, because as the European Space Agency, we have 3 lunar orbit slots, and our intention, is to put an astronaut an ESA astronaut on the lunar surface by 2030. So I think this is where the United Kingdom needs to leverage even more its already significant role within ESA. And of course, as a reminder, when the astronauts are getting this sort of resolution view of the Earth, they'll be taking us with them vicariously. So it's not just about the science. The communications of what we're doing is absolutely key. And talking about communications, you know, mega constellations, hundreds or even thousands of networked satellites in low Earth orbit, meaning that satellite internet for billions of people could become a reality. We're seeing it in Ukraine, but there are challenges associated with that sort of architecture. Again, this is a screen grab of every object, bigger, every satellite, operational and defunct, currently orbiting Earth earlier today. I used Lea Labs. 19,000 objects there, of which 7,000 are active satellites. But what I'm now going to introduce is every piece of space debris bigger than 1 centimeter. And you can see it's like bees swarming around a honeypot. This is really worrying because, of course, many of you will remember from 2009 when we had a collision between Iridium-33, so one of the Iridium SATCOM satellites, and a defunct Soviet-era recon satellite, Cosmos 2251. Now, that particular event, you know, we're seeing it modeled with AGI software here, produced thousands of bits of debris. But this was a time when space wasn't crowded. Space is 50 times more crowded now, and maybe not 50 times, actually, probably about 20 times more crowded now in terms of active satellites. We are really worried now about the potential for impacts to have runaway effects where these other bits of space debris, the size of a pound coin, kinetic energy of a Land Rover hitting you at 70 miles an hour, if it takes out satellites, other satellites, could we get a runaway Kessler effect? We're approaching a threshold quite rapidly because China has really driven forwards in the last few years. The most advanced human spaceflight structure in low Earth orbit at the moment is not the ISS, it's the China space station. You can see images on the right. China's first mission to Mars, an orbiter rover lander, astonishingly successful. And we had this amazing selfie with a wireless camera that the Zhurong rover took. And China has gone ahead with demonstrating quantum telecommunications capability with their Mizhu quantum communications satellite. China has got an ambition in the next 5 years to have its own mega constellation of 13,000 satellites. And so we can see Chinese capabilities, we can see Chinese ambitions, and we can see the geopolitical posturing that is driving what is referred to in the media as the new space race. Finally, though, from a science perspective, you know, why am I so excited? Well, the most important thing to me is that by studying other planets, we better understand our home planet. So comparative planetology, our understanding of the Earth has been accelerated by our scientific understanding of the planet Venus on the left and of the planet Mars on the right. And in conclusion, you know, a question I often get asked, why don't we get robots to do it all? Because they're great. Well, they're not that great. You know, Perseverance, a mission that I'm involved with through our ESA programs, has done wonderful work on the surface of Mars for the last 20 months. But the distance that Perseverance covered in its first 16 months was the distance that Jack Schmitt, the only scientist to go to the moon, covered on the last lunar mission, Apollo 17, with a crew in 3 days. Because by the time we build space hardware, flight qualify it, send it on its trajectory, it's years, it's obsolete. But having a trained human observer, you know, they can be up to date, they can be flexible, which in a way that our most advanced robotic systems for exploration simply cannot do. And so in conclusion, you know, we've got an integrated ecosystem of astronomy, of exploration, of satellite applications where people's skills are and capabilities are transferable between all of them. You know, that line that I used, it's Air Marshal Harv Smith's line, you know, this is the most exciting time in space since the 1960s. And I suppose the thing I'm going to add is that it's also the most challenging time when we look at the increasingly turbulent and multipolar geopolitical landscape that we're in this first part of the 21st century, you know, going into the third decade. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing there. I probably bust my time limit by about 3 or 4 minutes. I apologize, Greg, but we've still got 35 minutes for questions. Greg, back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anu. No, you didn't bust it. I think it was me that nicked the first 3 minutes waffling. So without further ado, thank you so much for that. Really fascinating stuff. I mean, I think we're all perhaps a little bit guilty sometimes, again, literally a bit starry-eyed about space, but you've really given a great summary there of where we've come in the last few years and what's ahead. The first, I've got two questions, both from Paul Sanger-Davis, who's Director of Defence Studies for the Air Force. So let's go into those. Let's do them one at a time. What have we learned in Ukraine about commercial military cooperation, and do you see that something that will only increase? Can you give us a view on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm thinking of the stuff that I'm privy to. So the one that I would highlight is Starlink. Elon Musk had made that tremendous offer, which was underwritten by SpaceX itself. Of course, he's been making noises about now is the US government going to pay for this, but the fact is that a mega constellation that had been developed for commercial reasons is what's kept the Ukrainian comms architecture, the Ukrainian economy, let alone the wider societal spirit of people going. Because without that comms architecture that had been provided by Starlink, then not only would the morale have just been wiped out, but the coherent, organized defense capabilities just could not have been delivered. So that's a demonstrator of how a commercially driven capability is having clear defense needs. Going further than that, I highlighted Maxar. Maxar is a commercial satellite company that released examples of imagery they have openly to highlight the examples I showed. Now, I'm not privy to the discussions that Maxar may or may not have been having with defense with defense leaders in the West, but it shows that there is a capability there. Now, that could establish or manifest itself in an opportunistic way. And of course, it then looks to the argument of why duplicate in a defense program a commercially available capability if you can get into an exclusivity argument with the commercial provider to have, restricted data for defense purposes. But it also shows, I think, that, and this is now a personal, view, that I think we should be exploring even further, if we have got, and the UK has got an interest, say, in OneWeb, which is merging with Eutelsat, we're going to have future versions, every 5 to 7 years of these OneWeb satellites, because the beauty of these small satellites is they're designed to only last 5 to 7 years. So they don't become obsolete. You can upgrade them and so on. That might give us an opportunity to have dual use architectures of existing mega constellations for which we've got the spectrum filings in the case of OneWeb, Eutelsat, call it what you will, after the merger. So I think there's potential that can be explored there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I sort of, and he may not be able to tell me the answer, because I think we've seen it, haven't we? That Elon Musk, he's a character, and how much can he be relied upon? We certainly saw a time when we weren't sure if it was going to continue because the funding, etc. And maybe in a situation where it's Ukraine, it's more cut and dried, and therefore there's no reason not to provide. But if it was a contentious scenario, could we see commercial operators pull out of supporting the military? I think that's a fascinating area, and a real difficult one, I think, for the militaries to come to terms with. Yeah,
so that issue of safeguarding your sovereign capability in the event that a commercial entity either lets you down or starts behaving with other nations in a way that is not one that you'd support. Yeah. So again, you've got that tensioning, the economic cost of having that sovereign capability, where at least that you are protecting it. You've got a great degree of control and resilience there.
So Paul has brilliantly predicted your answer, because he's asked, where could we focus in the UK best in terms of making our capability the most effective? And I'm sure he's talking from a military perspective, but I'd be more than happy if you broaden that into a commercial as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm involved, and again, some of you may have heard this before. So we've got a tremendous amount of expertise in the research and innovation sector from the academic side, and people will have heard me speak about this before. I think we need to have, and we're getting the right approaches now, a much more deep linkages where appropriate between the capabilities we've been developing in academia for research and innovation on the civil side, and looking at how that can accelerate progress towards some defense capabilities that we want to have manifest through space capabilities. Now, you know, they are there. And one of the challenges is, again, I've said this before, is that, you know, stereotypically at the extremes, those two communities are looking through each other, perhaps with the wrong lenses, with the wrong prisms. So, you know, taking the stereotype, there are many in the academic world, you know, who are still, as soon as you talk about defense space, they're thinking SDI 1980s, they're thinking like offensive weapons capability on orbit, you know, and then you may get people within the defense side, again, this is a stereotype, who are thinking, you know, our academic colleagues are just going to think this is selling out to collaborate with us, you know, and then you can impose any sort of political ideology that you might think resides in academia there. The truth is, I think if we can recalibrate people to think that defense capabilities for space are safeguarding, you know, this is safeguarding, you know, our capabilities as a nation, then you can get people thinking differently. Because certainly on the Earth observation side, you know, the applications of synthetic aperture radar data, I mean, you know, this has been used in the civil side and the defense side for decades. But what we're seeing now is real acceleration in the pace at which we can process data and the resolution because of the use of high performance computing, because of the use of AI. And this is an area where, say, for example, my research council, STFC, is really pushing forwards in terms of the other partnerships we have in terms of quantum computing developments and high performance computing. So getting those academic defense partnerships going, we have some good ones, but I think we can go much, much further, and we can do this at a much higher rate of working.
Yeah, I've got a couple more questions to that, but I'm going to leave them towards the end. But just linking back then to UK capability, and obviously with the news recently of the challenges of launching in the UK from Cornwall, Virgin Orbit, how critical do you think a UK launch capability is for sovereignty?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, you know, we're going to see other European launch centres. So Esrange in Sweden was opened to much fanfare. I mean, that's an existing, they've done lots and lots of suborbital launches there, the same from Andøya in Norway. So there is going to be competition in Europe, you know, this year. In terms of orbital launch. So, you know, we've got to come up with something that makes the UK a really, really viable proposition. And the agency is pushing forward with this, because where we have real expertise is small satellite manufacturers. So what you want to do is you want to get inward investors from you know, nations or companies around the world, where the United Kingdom can be the one-stop shop, so that our partnerships can help somebody who wants a service, you know, design, build, flight qualify, and launch their satellite in one place. Now, when you look at that value proposition, you've got to support the various elements equally or you know, at the right pace to come in at the right time. And the agency is doing it in its strategy, hence its cluster strategy. But I think we need to keep that momentum going, because, you know, the sorts of cadence we're going to get for launch are not that high. So Virgin Orbit are talking about 2 launches per year from Cornwall. You know, we had a setback in terms of vertical launch with ABL's RS-1 launcher, which failed last week, again in the same week as Virgin Orbit on an orbital launch attempt from Kodiak in Alaska. And so, you know, it reminds us that space is hard. Is it absolutely crucial? No, it's not, because we've got other capabilities, but it is a valuable and growing part of the UK space ecosystem, and it has a lot of potential to grow even further. Okay, thanks for that. Interesting. So just playing again on that European angle, and heaven forbid the Brexit word, but how have you seen the challenges since Brexit, and where do you think the future lies for cooperation and collaboration with Europe for the UK? Yeah, so this is a personal view. So, you know, we did lose out through Brexit because we were powerhouses in the United Kingdom in the Galileo GNSS, so Global Navigation Satellite Systems, European GPS. We were powerhouses in terms of the first generation of Galileos with Surrey satellites, etc. And of course, we were, because we left the European Union, it's the EU that funded the program delivered through ESA. So we lost out. We did have an opportunity to buy into the service, what's called the PRS, Publicly Regulated Service, which is sort of like the one that's got a much higher level of fidelity that could be used for defense applications. We chose not to politically. We're developing a position navigation and timing program, but have we lost out? Well, we lost out through Galileo. There is a public perception that ESA is the EU, and it's not. The EU has established its own space programs agency, and I suppose where I'm going with this is that the EU is wielding, a lot of influence within ESA, but we remain the fourth largest contributor to the European Space Agency. And in some areas, ESA, for all of its activities, it really needs UK capabilities. So one of the areas I'm involved in, which is space nuclear power sources for exploration, which potentially could also be used to meet our net zero goals. The UK is a leader in terms of capability within Europe, and ESA recognizes that. So I think we can't be good at everything. Given the political agreements as to how much we're going to throw into ESA, we don't put in as much as France, Germany, and Italy, but we come in at a healthy fourth. And in some areas, we are leading the field, say in terms of telecoms, etc. What we need to do is to leverage the areas within ESA where we are leading, so that not only can we drive ESA forwards with its ambitions, but we can leverage that same capacity to develop standalone bilaterals with other countries. Because that's what France, Germany, and Italy do. They leverage their ESA capabilities to get their standalone bilateral relationships. And they do this on the civil side, and they apply it on the defense side as well. And I think we could do that much, much better.
Yeah, thanks. So just taking that a little bit further, this is Jeffrey Warl's question. What are the realistic chances of a collaborative EU-US-Asia space clearance program in the near future? And I've used exactly his words there. But I guess a broader question: what alliances do you see out there that perhaps and obviously you're involved in the Middle East quite significantly. So where do you think the groupings are going to come from, or where do you see the opportunities?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and this again is just my speculation. So EU notwithstanding as an entity, we have long established deep security relationships through NATO and elsewhere with EU member states. So to my mind, and then we look at the geopolitical drivers. So we want to deepen our collaborations with India. We know that how this is seen by China. We know that this is looking at some of the forcing functions that are coming out through the integrated review in this rapidly changing landscape we're seeing and the emergence of the global south. So I would see, at core to me, we've got the Five Eyes relationships. We know that Japan is a trusted ally there. We know that we've got our allies within the Gulf region as well. And we know we've got the strengthening relationships with India, say, also with South Africa. And again, looking at the South Africa, China, Russia relationships, again, we get some tension. So I don't have a simple answer for you. But I do think that the work we are doing in looking in certain areas, beyond Five Eyes, and looking to our growing partnerships within what I'll call the global south, but are going to be emerging as major economic drivers even more as we go through this century. I think that's the right approach to do. There will be times, I mentioned South Africa, for instance, where this is going to make challenges, because we can have deepening engagement with South Africa, but we're aware of the Chinese long-standing relationships in Southern Africa. We're aware of, some of the ambiguities we've seen in terms of South Africa and the way it's viewed Ukraine and Russia's actions. And so it's not an easy exam question to answer. We need to be pragmatic, and it means that we might need to compartmentalize, the parameter space of defense-related capabilities with which we're going to engage in this wider portfolio of countries outside the Five Eyes and the trusted individual EU partners.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating area, isn't it? Because in the whole sort of geostrategic classic alliances, space clearly drives the coach and horses through them. So yeah, in many ways, I guess it allows us to make new allies that perhaps weren't as easy to do previously. So this is from a DJ Saul Pooley. Again, I read that out verbatim. I don't think he's in Ibiza, but you never know. What is the legal position relating to leaving space debris? Is there sufficient insurance cover to reimburse for damage caused? And is there a process for seeking recompense from countries who are space vandals? His words.
Now, I am not, I wish Joanne Wheeler, one of my colleagues here, she's one of Europe's leading space lawyers, was on the call because she could answer this much better than me. But to give you an idea, with space debris, at the moment, space is getting crowded there. There is no internationally binding agreement that says you've got to remove it. I wish there were, and we could argue that when we look at the Outer Space Treaty, 1967, the United Nations, certainly there's a lot of internal movement amongst member states from the Committee of Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to upgrade, to look at the new era we're in, and we need to have some significant changes to that governance architecture. What the UK is leading on is trying to, in terms of what we call the long-term sustainability of space, is try to establish a framework for what is good behavior and use that influence. Now, to my mind, the solution is actually quite simple in that if you can get, and this is simplistic, we know that a satellite is going to be, if it's in low Earth orbit, it might have a 5 to 15-year orbital lifetime before its orbit's going to decay and it's going to re-enter the atmosphere. Re-enters the atmosphere, that's absolutely fine. It's being recycled. This material was on Earth to start with, and it's returning to Earth in the air. I've got no problem with material burning up in the atmosphere. If we could do it in a control way, if we could persuade satellite operators to keep extra propellant on board so that we could have a controlled deorbit at end of life into an area where if it's a larger satellite, it's not going to cause any damage, then that way you're helping address some of the issues that we're currently struggling with. Because at the moment, satellite operators generally aren't doing it because every extra kilogram that they have to put on Earth orbit is costing them thousands. And then if you're talking about, just off the top of my head, if you're talking about sort of having that capability to deorbit at end of life with a reserve amount of propellant and the engine architecture you'll need, if that's going to be an extra 30 kilograms, that translates in reduced profits to the bottom line. So I think we need to influence the satellite manufacturers more. I think we're seeing some really nice demonstrators of technologies to intercept satellites and actually deorbit them. Now, they're greatest technology demonstrators. My concern is who is going to be the end customer that's going to pay for this? When we've got the TRL curve and you go through the valley of death, it's always who is going to be the customer at the end of the process that's going to do this. And if you've got a technology where a satellite can change in multiple orbit planes, which is not easy, and effectively deorbit 10 satellites, that's going to be a very, very expensive capability to have and to commercialize. And who is ultimately getting paid for it? Is it nation states? Is it, I don't know. I don't have an answer. And the liability issues, there are liability frameworks for launch, from my understanding. And this is an area where UK Space Agency leads. But in terms of overall governance, we don't have much that is applying for the concerns that we have at the moment. I hope that makes sense, because this could be the question is great, but it's actually the topic of a 2 or 3 day seminar. And as a non-expert in space law, I don't want to speculate.
Yeah, no, I think you summarised it well. I mean, maybe my High Wycombe Council can get onto you because they certainly charge a lot of money for me dropping stuff off of their dump these days. I mean, and I think if you separate out what is effectively fly tipping or equivalent in space, but what about the genuine mischief, and I use that word advisedly, who are out to create trouble in space? How, and I'll take the question perhaps a little bit further, how vulnerable is space to that type of act? Let's just use Russia. Sorry, let's out them. Let's say Russia are so far behind in terms of their space advantage that they decide that the best way to to equalise is to basically cause mayhem in space. How fragile is and will space be to that type of actor?
It's a really good question. Now, in terms of Russia, their civil space program has been in decline for decades. I mean, actually, and you may have heard me say this before, the ISS program enabled us to put in $400 million a year during the Shuttle Mir program, in fact, and exert some degree of command and control. And, the collaboration, Russia's civil program has been in decline for a long time. And their Soyuz architecture is ancient. We've got a problem with the Soyuz that's docked on the space station at the moment. Their military space side, though, has had massive funding and is going like this. So, there is real potential there. The anti-satellite demonstration they did last year, caused massive problems for us in the International Space Station Partnership and elsewhere. And I've got a feeling that Roscosmos, I don't know, had no idea this was happening, because this actually affected the Russian cosmonauts who were on station as well. We had to do these multiple debris avoidance maneuvers of the entire station because of the threat of space debris caused by that. Now, the United States has said, and the US, India, China, Russia have all demonstrated anti-satellite capabilities by shooting down satellites, be it over a few years ago, be it decades ago. The US has done a really good step in saying, look, we are not going to do any more of these demonstrations. And the US in this area is trying to, the UK has come on board as well. We're trying to establish a framework of what is good behavior. But this is a real worry because, and one of my concerns about something that is flavor of the month at the moment, and it's got some potential, but I think there are some real challenges, space-based solar power, is, if you've got an infrastructure on orbit which you're relying on for a critical capability, which is energy generation, don't tell me that it's fine, it's out 35,800 kilometers in a geostationary orbit. If somebody wants to take out that capability, either through direct disruption or through communications and, AI network disruption capability, electronically, that is a real worry. So I think that the worry we have for our orbital architecture is not just physical kinetic attacks, but it's also, everything from if you've got a surveillance capability, blinding it with lasers, interfering. If you've got a mega constellation that is networked, what is the computational network resistance, to interference. I do worry about it because our reliance on the architectures and the services we're getting from space, especially in a network capacity, it's going up like this, which leaves us even more vulnerable. Again, I don't have a simple answer. What I would say is that as the space sector, and we are doing this, we need to be working even more proactively with the cyber community, with the resilience community in multiple areas. So space is multidisciplinary, but space resilience is also multidisciplinary and multifaceted.
You may not be able to comment on this, and if you can't, that's fine. Has there been any interference from actors such as Russia in the last year because of what's happening in Ukraine, or is it something even they feel is a line they can't cross?
I don't know is the answer. I mean, there are some who have posited that for example, there was one in particular with a satellite changing orbits. This was almost like, look, this is a demonstration of what we can do. It was a close proximity from a Russian satellite. China has demonstrated that capability as well in relation to close proximity to the ISS. That China themselves said that, and I think the data may have supported this, that there was a potential conjunction between one of the Starlink satellites. I mean, this was accidental, and the new China space station, because Starlink satellites are in a significantly lower orbit, say, than the OneWeb satellites. They're in a 340 to 500 kilometer altitude, and we orbit the ISS at 400 kilometers. So the potential is there, and it's a real worry. And, if you have got your back against the wall in terms of what's happening, then you want to make threatening noises. This is a real worry. As somebody who's just observing some of those aspects and advising on those, is something that I would say is very high on the risk register.
Yeah. So last 9 minutes, let's just come back to the UK. I've got a couple of questions here that sort of focus back on home base, if you like. This is from Patrick Sinnott. and he's looking for comments. So it's a slightly cryptic question, but I'll read it out. Hopefully, he's the way he's worded is the way he's lit up. Space is a strategic national technology flywheel? Question mark.
Sorry, I lost a bit with your bandwidth there, Greg. It's a strategic
national technology flywheel.
That's really interesting because
Did you hear that?
Flywheels, you know, I can interpret a flywheel as being a reservoir of rotational kinetic energy that you can tap into. I can also see a flywheel as being a driver of many other systems. I can also see a flywheel getting out of control and coming off its bearings and capable of doing a lot of damage. So it's an interesting analogy. And of course, you can use a flywheel for gyroscopic stability. So again, analogies are great. I would say it's a very powerful one. Patrick, I might well use it. And by the way, thank you very much for your messages earlier today, Patrick. I would say it absolutely is, because, you know, I've speculated on the meaning of that, but it is something which those capabilities are giving us stability, just as we get from gyroscopes in 3 dimensions. Those capabilities that we have from our space are applicable across the range of our activities. Those capabilities we have from our space capability, or for our space architectures, are effective multipliers in other domains. So yes, it is a flywheel, but also when I talked about the risk of a flywheel coming off its axes, we therefore need to make sure that that sector, so this is what I draw from it, that sector is nurtured and supported and driven forwards. Now, government is doing that. What I'm really pleased about. So sorry if I'm going off on a tangent with your question, Patrick, but I want to take it in a certain direction. The last 2-3 years has seen a transformation in the UK space government's landscape, and it's been for the better. So we've now got what was MOD Space Directorate, which has now become the Space Policy Unit, catalysing the formation of UK Space Command. We've got the BEI Space Directorate, but we're working cross-government. We've got the UK Space Agency working with Space Command in the areas where there is dual use. We've got the UK Space Agency now functioning as a delivery agency, but also working to influence strategy. This is great. This is a transformation. Now, what we've got to do is deliver, and we've got to make sure, and I suppose I'm part of this process with some of the work that I do, we've got to make sure that across the board, government is increasing its investment, because sometimes I think government is just looking, by the political nature of the government we have, at what short-term returns are going to manifest themselves within the electoral cycle. We need to look much further, and we need to push our funding levels up. Just in that area, for instance, the Italian Space Agency's funding settlement, €1 billion per year. You know, it more than doubles, or nearly doubles, sorry, the UK Space Agency's settlement, which is about $560 million per year, going up to $600 million per year, which is still an increase. But I think you see the message I'm getting at there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that. So our chairman has got the last 2 questions, bless him. So, is there any specific part of the UK supply or the value chain, space value chain in the UK, that you'd like to see us working harder on here nationally?
I would say we've always been really, really good at innovating. Now, what's interesting, there's that phrase that starvation is the forcing function for innovation. I think there's been some truth to that in the last 30 years. You know, we've had to innovate. We've had limited funds, and in some areas we've been disruptive innovators. You know, in the area of small satellites. So I know, you know, Patrick, who's on the call, was heavily involved right at the beginning with Sir Martin Sweeting. You know, in terms of really becoming a world leader in small satellites. What we need to do is we need to really keep pushing on that. Now, we've got a research and innovation philosophy that permeates everything that government does now. You know, we're working towards, by 2027, 2.4% of our GDP is going into research and innovation. Now, a lot of that's coming from the private sector. China is doing 2.4%, which is government funded. So I think government needs to up its investments into what we're doing. We've got a demonstrated track record in the areas that we are absolutely the best in the world, not just in terms of innovation for its own sake and entrepreneurship, but in terms of certain capabilities in small satellites, in, for example, the potential for, space nuclear power systems. If we look at the heritage from other companies like Rolls-Royce, within the nuclear sector, within the use on submarines and ships, etc. And we're starting to see those ecosystems coming together. But I think we need to really push forward and accelerate that further. The appetite within both the civil and the defense space directorates at policy level is there for this, and it's great. But we need to translate that upwards to make sure, for instance, that the great defense settlement that we got for space activities is continued and built on. The civil increases we've seen need to go up even more, but government needs to recognize that some of these, economic manifestations of success may take 10 years to become apparent. And you tension that against short-term political objectives, you've always got those challenges.
Yeah, thank you. So final question, which is, I think where you sit, this hour goes pretty fast, but the final question, and this is an opportunity to plug, by the way, so take it. Given the UK's ambitions for space, again, this is Mark, how well is the UK doing in terms of developing our future space expertise, i.e. Are we getting it right in our schools and universities?
Yeah, I think universities are coming around to much, much more that they need to, the old days where a university said, look, our job is just to train you up academically, and then you go out and forge your own, plow your own furrow or whatever. Those days are over, and we're seeing a lot more collaborations between universities to get people fit for industry. Skills at all levels is absolutely key because, if we're going to tech our way out of the challenges we face in the future, it's skills that's going to be the critical bottleneck issue. And what we've got to do is we've got to recognize that as a sector, we're small, and the talent that's coming through, we're competing with other sectors for that talent. So I'm optimistic on two levels. One is that UK Space Agency, for the first time, has really driven forwards, and skills development is now a top-level strategic priority, absolute top level when we're looking at the reorganization of the agency structure. I'm really, really pleased that when UK Space Command was established, in fact, when I first started working with Air Marshal Harve 2.5, 3 years ago, top priority from him, from Space Director, was skills development. And we're seeing a change in how it's seen. I think for many years, there were some great initiatives, but from the space sector, it was a bolt-on. It was to do if you have the capacity to do it. Now it's seen as underpinning architecture that is critical to enable us to be able to build on our capabilities and translate our ambitions into reality. So we're getting the change in the way it's seen strategically. We're getting an increase in funding, but we need to keep on doing this, and we need to communicate this much more effectively because we are competing with those other sectors. In fact, the whole comms issue of what we do, we need to do better. When HRH Prince William asked that question, I think a couple of years ago, why do we need space capabilities with so many challenges to the environment here on Earth? Many people in the sector really took offense at that. Whereas my perspective was, he's absolutely right. This is a failure of us as a sector to adequately communicate the benefit, the impact, the necessity of what we are doing. But I think we are changing now.
Yeah, and I was a youngster when the Moon Apollo program was ongoing, and it was clearly quite an influence on youngsters at the time. And we've had such a long period of perhaps, not much. So now we're beginning to see that again, and hopefully it will ignite. And I just want to do a quick plug on your behalf here, Anu. Obviously, the National Space Academy is dear to your heart. And unfortunately, you couldn't make the industry dinner just before Christmas. I can't remember if it was trains or COVID, but it was one or the other. But once we've
That one was
dotted the
trains,
I's,
yeah.
yeah, once we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's, I mean, one thing we're looking to do is put some sponsorship from the association into the academy to sort of outreach into the schools, which you know is a key program for you and your team. So hopefully we'll be able to make that announcement really, really soon, because I think that'll be quite exciting from both our perspectives, I'm sure.
Yeah, we're really delighted with this, and this is part of an ongoing sort of deepening relationship that we're having. You know, we have it already with UK Space Agency and Space Command, so you're another natural core partner. Because I think from a personal perspective, you know, my roots originally, you know, I've loved space since I was 5 years old, but I grew up in aviation. My dad worked at Gatwick all his life. So to my mind, I'm one of the people on the space side who is as passionate about aviation and aerospace, and I see so much cross-fertilization and increased potential that we have. So from a professional and a personal perspective, I'm absolutely delighted with the collaboration that we're having. Thank you again to the Air and Space Power Association for working with us.
Good stuff. And we'll make that announcement really, really soon. Look, I'm really sorry you couldn't make the dinner. You were going to be sat next to me, so maybe you're not that sad. But I would have been asking you questions about your time with Felix Baumgartner and your work on that.
We'll save that for another evening.
Exactly that. So Anu, on behalf of everybody, couldn't get to all the questions in an hour, but on behalf of everybody who's listening, absolutely fascinating hour. Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing from you again, but more importantly, working with you as we begin, but continue this exciting journey.
No, thank you very much to everyone at the Air and Space Power Association, and also the Freeman Air and Space Institute. It is a real privilege for me to be able to work with both organisations. Thank you.
Good stuff. Safe travels. All the best, everyone.